Episode 12, The Cost of Blood. Proverbs 14:12. There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death. The night was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel heavier. I was sitting on the steps outside the corner store, watching the streetlights flicker like they couldn't decide whether to stay on or die out. Then it happened. Jacob stepped into the alley, his hand stuffed casually into his jacket pocket like he wasn't walking into a war. Across the way, Darnell and two of his boys emerged from the shadows, their faces tense and their movements tight. I didn't have to hear the words to know what was being said. Their body language was screaming one thing. This was it. The first crack of gunfire shattered the silence like breaking glass. I flinched involuntarily, ducking behind a parked car as the echoes ricocheted down the street. Jacob moved fast, faster than I thought possible, pulling a strap from his jacket. He fired, a sharp burst that sent one of Darnell's guys crumpling to the pavement. The second tried to rush Jacob, but caught a shot square in the chest, folding like a book slammed shut. The third one panicked, shooting wildly as he backed out of the alley. Jacob didn't follow him. The kid disappeared into the night like a rabbit into a hole, his shots pinging harmlessly off nearby dumpsters. I stayed glued to my spot, watching Jacob sprint out of the alley, his face pulled tight like a wound that wouldn't scab over. He crossed the street in a dead run and stopped in front of me, shoving the gun into my chest so hard it knocked me off balance. "Put it in a bag and go that way," he barked, nodding toward the direction of the overpass. "I'll catch up to you later." My hands moved on instinct, wrapping around the cold metal as he ran off. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until he was gone. I moved quickly, avoiding streetlights and busy corners, my heart thudding in my chest like a drumbeat I couldn't silence. By the time I reached the bridge where we were supposed to meet, Jacob was already there, pacing like a lion in a cage. He didn't say a word as he tied the gun to a crumbling red brick with a piece of twine he pulled from his pocket. When he handed it to me, he pointed to the edge of the bridge. "Toss it in and make sure it sinks." I didn't hesitate. The splash felt louder than it probably was, but when the ripples faded, so did some part of me I didn't think I'd ever get back. Word came the next morning that Darnell and his right-hand man had succumbed to their injuries at County Hospital. The news rippled through the block, sparking waves of hushed conversations on stoops and muted arguments in apartment lobbies. The failed assassination attempt wasn't just a loss for Darnell's crew. It was a line drawn in blood across the neighborhood. People started picking sides. Neutrality wasn't just frowned upon. It was dangerous. The air felt different, thicker, like the tension itself could snap and take all of us with it. The police recovered a weapon near Darnell's body. It was linked directly to the murder of that kid on Miller Street, the one whose death had sent shockwaves through the block. The whispers began almost immediately, fingers pointing and connections being made. The streets would remember this. Coming back from the bridge that night, Elijah intercepted me before I even reached the block. He grabbed my arm and pulled me into a dark corner, his face inches from mine, his voice low but quaking with fury. "You think you're smart playing this game? You think you can walk away from this unscathed?" His words churned in my chest, each one landing like a blow to the gut. "You're not built for this, and you know it. Keep playing, and you won't last long." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just stood there, his anger wrapping around me like a vice, until he finally let go and walked away. Mom's health had turned a corner in recent weeks, something I clung to as proof that all of this, the lies, the fear, the guilt, it was worth it. Her energy was back in her voice, her laughter felt less forced, and even her cough was fading. Funny how a little money could do what years of prayers and empty promises from the doctors hadn't. But every time I handed her the pills and saw the relief in her eyes, the weight of what I'd done to get them pressed harder on my shoulders. The block felt like it had split in half overnight. You couldn't walk 2 steps without hearing whispers about who was with Jacob, who was still loyal to Darnell's remnants, and who was trying to stay invisible. The invisible ones didn't last long. Lines had been drawn, and the fences were sharp. We were either going to learn to survive in this new war zone or find a way out altogether. Neither option felt particularly possible. The news about Shay Shay's dad hit harder than I expected, mostly because of the way it spread like a morbid game of telephone. Rumor had it that he'd been shanked in county jail, stabbed in the gut over and over again because someone found out he dry snitched on Jacob. They said it was an accident, that he hadn't meant to hit that boy when the gun went off. But who was he aiming at then? Nobody seemed to know, and if he didn't pull through, that secret was going to die with him. Dr. J was becoming a familiar face around Elijah's camp, floating in and out of meetings with a notebook in one hand and a thermos in the other. He wasn't loud about it, but you could tell he was making moves, smoothing out plans, offering his expertise in subtle but effective ways. It was odd at first, seeing him in that context, but it gave a strange sense of hope. Maybe small moves could still change big things. Despite the death and chaos swirling through the neighborhood, Jacob carried himself like a king who just conquered a rival kingdom. He moved with extra swagger, his smile cutting through conversations like he owned every square inch of pavement he stepped on. I couldn't tell if it was confidence or a mask for something else, but either way, it was unnerving. Being near him now felt more like standing next to a live wire than a lifeline. I kept my distance from everyone that week, avoiding calls, texts, and the usual stoop gatherings. The streets felt smaller, more confined, like the walls were closing in on all of us at once. You could hear it in the way people spoke, their voices harder, their laughter shorter. We were all pretending this place hadn't changed, but it had, and nobody wanted to be the first to admit it. One night, I caught myself staring at the river where we'd tossed the gun. The water moved sluggishly, reflecting bits of moonlight that made it look deceptively serene. A part of me wondered if the gun had settled at the bottom, or if the current had carried it somewhere else, some other bend in the river where it might resurface one day. The thought gave me chills, so I turned away and headed home, struggling to shake the feeling that nothing stayed buried forever. Mom asked me if I was okay that night, her voice softer than usual. I nodded and mumbled something about being tired. She didn't press, but her eyes stayed on me for a few seconds longer than usual. It was like she could see the cracks forming in me, hairline fractures that might one day split wide open. When she finally turned back to her book, I exhaled, grateful for the temporary reprieve. The dream started not long after. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of gunfire echoing in my ears, even though the room was silent. It wasn't always the gunfire, though. Sometimes it was Elijah's words, other times it was Darnell's face, his expression frozen in that moment before he hit the ground. The worst nights were the ones where I saw myself holding the gun, my finger squeezing the trigger in slow motion as the guilt bled straight into my chest. I wasn't sure what scared me more, the thought of staying or the thought of leaving. The block was all I'd ever known, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a time bomb, and I was just another doomed piece of shrapnel waiting to explode. But leaving meant figuring out where to go, what to do, and how to rebuild myself without the weight I'd been dragging behind me for so long. Either way, the choice didn't feel like mine to make anymore. It felt like something that was going to happen to me, whether I was ready for it or not.